March 4th, 1865. Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural dawned with rain and hail in Washington, D.C. The capital was less a city than a collection of villages, and its unpaved streets were caked in mud 10 inches deep. Still, thousands trudged to the Capitol to witness the president's inaugural address. Lincoln's new vice president, Tennessee Democrat Andrew Johnson, was sworn in first in front of Congress. His speech that day would make an impression that would uncannily reflect his unexpected presidency just 6 weeks later.
Johnson drank several glasses of whiskey before he went to be inaugurated. So he gives a speech in which he's slurring his words and losing his way. It's humiliating.
He began to give a drunken harangue about how he was a plebeian, a man of the common people. He began to refer to members of the cabinet there, and he couldn't really remember their name. He even had to be pulled down by his coattails by another member of the cabinet. This is not promising material.
As the only Southern senator to remain in the Union during the Civil War, Johnson was chosen as vice president to forge a national unity ticket with Lincoln. But the strategy backfired when John Wilkes Booth fired that shot in Ford's Theater. Andrew Johnson was suddenly the leader of a country still divided by war and a government divided by party.
Andrew Johnson was essentially at the head of a Republican administration, but he wasn't a Republican, he was a Democrat.
So here you've got a president who has been elected by one party, belongs to another, with a Congress very much in the opposite party from himself. He's going to have problems, deep problems.
Andrew Johnson was no stranger to struggle. The dirt poor boy from Tennessee had taught himself to read and write and worked his way up from an indentured servant to a backwoods tailor to U.S. Senator to the 17th President of the United States. But the uncompromising attitude he developed along the way proved ill-suited for the highest office in the country.
He had no tact. He was a frontier brawler. That's what had got him to where he was. People who become president of the United States tend to think it's because I have these traits and I've been doing these sorts of things my whole life. So they're not going to change their ways.
Following Abraham Lincoln would have been a virtually impossible act for any president. Lincoln was outsized in terms of his emotions, his kindness, his affability, his good nature, and his political savvy, which was very, very great. So Johnson did have a problem.
The nation was desperate for a strong leader who could bring back the United to the United States. It would be a near impossible task. 15% of the nation had taken up arms against each other. More than 600,000 soldiers had died. The war left the Southern economy in ruins, and more than half of its towns were occupied by Union troops.
Andrew Johnson wanted to bring the states of the South back into full-fledged membership of the Union as rapidly as possible. He didn't want them to pay any particular price. So Johnson was on a different track from Congress, and so it was ripe for battle, and there was battle.
Johnson grabbed the reins of power quickly and set his plans in motion while Congress wasn't in session.
The sessions were very short. Members came in for a relatively brief term, 5 months, met from December to May. They adjourned before D.C. got hot.
So Johnson is in control of what the first months of Reconstruction are going to be like. And what he does is he says that when the former Confederates ask for pardons and are pardoned by me, then they can come back into the Union.
Andrew Johnson was prepared to leave a lot of autonomy to the southern states. He believed that they should pretty much reconstruct themselves.
Johnson issued orders for the seceded states to hold elections and announced 2 simple conditions for the southern states to be readmitted to the Union and Congress.
Southern states must agree that secession had been illegal, null and void, and they must essentially accept the 13th Amendment. They must agree that slavery was over, and over for good. Those were the conditions that were set. But the North had wanted something more than that.
The radical Republicans in Congress wanted really to stick it to the South. And they did believe, as a matter of political philosophy, that African Americans in the South should achieve something much closer to equal rights than they had.
The passage of the 13th Amendment at the end of 1865 had freed more than 4 million slaves. In open defiance, the Southern state legislatures responded by enacting what were called the Black Codes.
Any black out there without a job can immediately be put to any kind of labor you want. Any black kid can be taken away from his family and can be apprenticed. And they can be sold for up to a year of their labor. What does that sound like? Does it sound like slavery to you?
The Republican-dominated Congress was furious, seeing these state laws as a ploy to keep the old slavery system in effect. A full-scale political war erupted between Johnson and Congress, who thought the president was letting the South off easy.
Johnson says this is basically a continuation of the war powers. I can do what I want to do. And Congress says, no, you can't.
There was no longer a war, so Congress did not need to defer to him because there was no longer an emergency situation. And so it did everything it could and to actually take back power and to make Congress the center of policymaking.
When Johnson vetoes the Civil Rights Act, there is this sudden realization that this man can't be trusted. They viewed Johnson as going beyond Lincoln's policies.
For only the 8th time in the nation's 90-year history, Congress overrode the president's veto. The Civil Rights Bill passed. Over the next 3 years, Johnson issued 21 vetoes, more than George Washington, James Madison, Andrew Jackson, and Abraham Lincoln combined. Congress overrode 71% of them, the highest for any president.
Johnson did not like to negotiate. He did not like to consult. He just wanted to act. And so Johnson was not an effective president, and the Republicans in Congress got their way.
The battle next moved into the 1866 congressional elections. Johnson set a precedent by becoming the first president to actively campaign against the opposing political party. He went on a whistle-stop tour he called the Swing Around the Circle.
Andrew Johnson went from Washington up to New York and then across the Northwest all the way to Chicago, advocating his policy of Reconstruction and attacking radical Republicans at every train stop. So it proved to be a disaster. It was the most counterproductive exercise in presidential speech-making in American history. Republicans won the congressional elections of 1866 overwhelmingly.
A combination of radical Republicans and moderate Republicans hold a 2/3 majority in Congress so that any veto that Johnson might have applied to their measures they could overturn because they had enough power.
A tug of war between the two branches quickly ensued.
They pass a Reconstruction Act that reverses much of what he had done. And then they come up with the Tenure of Office Act, which doesn't allow Johnson to fire one of his cabinet members without the Senate reviewing it.
Andrew Johnson wanted quite naturally to be able to fire the people who worked for him. And Congress said, no, you can't.
Johnson was not going to give up any of his executive authority. Defying the Republican Congress, he fired Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, a Republican and a Lincoln holdover.
Congress immediately sees this as the first step to use military force to take over the War Department so that you can control the Army and you can use it for goodness knows what kind of purposes.
It's not terribly surprising that he would become the first president to be impeached. The level of distrust and hatred was extreme during this presidency.
On February 24th, 1868, Congress, for the first time, impeached a sitting president on 11 counts of high crimes and misdemeanors. Johnson's fate would be decided in a trial by the Senate 3.5 months later.
No one knows for sure how the vote is going to go. It's very narrow. A few senators, there's a feeling that they may go one way or they may go the other. It's not clear. Imagine a day where you've got one of the senators deathly ill being carried in on a chair to vote.
It would take a 2/3 vote in the Senate to convict. At the time, that meant 36 votes, and there were 45 Republicans in the Senate.
The vote was 35 votes to convict, 19 to acquit. Johnson got off by 1 vote.
They thought that it would probably permanently weaken the presidency, that it would tip the balance too far in the direction of Congress.
But Johnson's victory was a hollow one. He had no power, and he had damaged the office of the president.
Throughout the entire Johnson administration, it's fundamentally a struggle, because it's about reconstruction, of who has power, the president or Congress. And coming out of this, it's very clear that Congress is the winner in this struggle.